I hate to break up great conversation, and I know the brownies and the cookies are in the back. But we'd love you to grab one and make your way up front here because we'd like to get started. I'm a party cooper, aren't I? All that conversation stopped. So greetings, everybody, and welcome to the final plenary discussion of the day. I'm really excited. This is the keynote presentation around land and infrastructure development, reconsidering equity, ecology, and economy. I would like to introduce Seth Otto. Seth is a senior planner with Mall Foster Longy, and he will go forward. I was reading a share with our panelists. So, Seth, take it away.
No problem. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody, for your attention, sticking around for the last and probably best session of the day. You can tell everyone else who skipped out early. I am up here for a brief minute just to acknowledge Karen, Business Oregon, those folks with the shot glasses in the back. There they are. The great folks at NEBC, all of you who've worked to bring this conference together and make it what it is. It's been a phenomenal first day. My head is full with just a little bit of room left for this session. I've been coming to the Brownfield Summit for a decade, and just reflecting back on it, it's been an incredible group of people, an institution that provides a lot of important information, best practices, and opportunities for networking and career growth. So it's fantastic to see all of you that are part of that, to reconnect with friends, partners, mentors, and other folks involved in the industry. We've had some great sessions today, and it's great to hear about all the great work that folks are doing on the ground, under the ground, and often under the radar. You are the unsung heroes of your communities, and the planners, scientists, and engineers at Mall Foster and Longy are really proud to have the opportunity to work with many of you. We're also proud to be a part of this plenary keynote session here, advancing and continuing a conversation around centering equity, justice in the work that we do around economic development, infrastructure, and brownfield remediation. So with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Sarah Seeloff, who will introduce herself and the panelists. And again, thank you. Really appreciate you being here today.
Great. Make sure that my mic is on.
Just keep tapping it until something happens. Is this going?
Just want to make sure that the microphones are on. No?
You would think there'd be a switch or
Right.
button or something.
Maybe it's here.
Look, how many people does it take?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much.
I'll get sent to the hotel if I can.
Okay, we should just use those two down there.
Hidden button.
I'm going to grab the hotel.
What about these two down here?
No, those are just for the camera.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be right back.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, while we're waiting for microphones, and thank you very much for your tech support. We do have that one. Okay, very good.
Bobby coming through.
I was going to say, coming through.
Problem solver.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. Wonderful. Problem solving, thank you. So my name is Sarah Seeloff. I'm a senior planner at Mall Foster. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And it's an honor to be up on stage with our panelists, Ben Duncan and Brenda Bateman. I'm actually going to ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment because I think they can both offer some important context as to how we arrived at this conversation. But I just want to offer a couple of background comments as to how we came to be here today having this conversation about justice and equity and the work that we all do around brownfield redevelopment and infrastructure. And so this conference brings together those two worlds, and historically they were somewhat separate spheres, right? But here, emerging on the other side of this pandemic, right? We're all here in the same room. And brownfield redevelopment is really fundamentally multidisciplinary, right? So this is, I think, a really fruitful place to be with so many different disciplines represented. And brownfield redevelopment is, not only is it multidisciplinary, it's about intersections. And another important intersection that really underpins the work that we all do here is the intersection between environmental hazards and human and environmental health, right? And so we often speak about this in terms of environmental justice. And that's a term that I'm sure you've heard for some time. It's also been rising in the public eye in terms of policy and legal developments. And so, you know, environmental justice goes back, Ben, we were talking about this, right? The term was coined about 40 years ago in Warren County, North Carolina, and there's a really powerful story about a landfill for PCB contaminated soil and the protests that ensued in 1982 in this rural part of North Carolina in a county where most of the population was black. And the landfill went in, but the protests and the movement that they really helped to galvanize continue with us to this day, and that's actually, I think, in the longer run, right, part of what brings us here. So in 1994, the federal government there was the first federal executive order about environmental justice. This leads to the foundation of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which advises the EPA. It also leads to requirements to address environmental justice issues in NEPA, or under NEPA, excuse me, so in the context of environmental impact assessments. And move forward, right? In the last couple of years, we've had this really a kind of an explosion of environmental justice activities. So at the federal level, we've had 2 executive orders, one on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, another called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And within that second executive order, you may have heard about Justice 40, right? This is a program that sets a goal of directing 40% of the benefits of certain federal investments to environmentally overburdened communities, those who are experiencing the negative impacts of environmental hazards and health, negative health impacts. But at the state level too, right? In Oregon, we've seen a number of recent laws and moves to really advance environmental justice practice and really integrate environmental justice into the way that we conduct redevelopment here. And so just in the last year, there were a couple of laws that were passed. I won't go into detail to save time, but the big one to bear in mind is House Bill 4077. And what that did was it took the Environmental Justice Task Force that had been established in 2007 as an advisory board, and it made it permanent. So now Oregon has a permanent Environmental Justice Council. It's housed in the office of the governor, and its job is to advise the governor and state agencies on matters of environmental justice. That same law also directed DEQ to take steps to generate a state environmental justice mapping tool. If you're from Washington State, you might be familiar with the Washington Tracking Network or maybe with EJ Screen, right? So keep your eyes out because that's going to be moving forward in the next little bit. And hopefully we'll look forward to seeing a map come through soon. So all of that being said, we are here with Ben and with Brenda to have a discussion about how all of these laws and policies really filter into the work that we're doing and how we can help center them in the work that we're doing. And so I have spent too much time talking already. I would love for each of you to please introduce yourselves, give us a brief idea of where you're coming from, and just help us understand what you're bringing to the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'll start by just saying it's a real honor to be able to share the space with y'all, and I'm kind of energized coming out of the awards luncheon this afternoon. That was really inspiring, and I think will be foundational to some of the conversation we'll have over the next hour or so. And you'll see I have my notes here. I've been getting so excited in the conversations we've been having, so I'm going to try to stay relatively focused. in our discussion. But I'm going to start by just talking about kind of my own contextualization in this work. I cut my teeth as an environmental justice organizer. I was a founding board member of Opal Environmental Justice Oregon. That's doing grassroots, on the ground, organizing with EJ communities, low-income communities of color. I spent most of my professional career in environmental public health. Started as a community health worker, did home visits for the Healthy Homes program, so focused on housing and air toxics and vector control and bed bugs and all kinds of fun environmental health topics. And then I spent the last decade really centering in on this conversation of equity, first with the Health Equity Initiative at Multnomah County, Portland, Oregon, for those that might not be from here. And then the last 7 years prior to joining Currency West a year ago as the Chief Diversity and Equity Officer. So this work has certainly been a major part and very important in my professional arc. I'll also say that, this conversation that we're having around, you'll hear these themes around community voice and community benefit kind of interspersed through our dialogue, that, and we're calling it re-envisioning, but it's not re-envisioning for community. Right? Community's been asking and demanding for their voices to be able to influence decisions that affect their lives for a long time. Right? This is not new for community, even though it might feel new in some of the context that Sarah just laid out. The also thing that isn't new is the legacy of brownfields, and I think the legacy of blight in communities, the legacy of displacement, the legacy of gentrification, that's been all too often really the result of the exact things we're talking about here. Redevelopment, investment in community, right? Brownfield reimaginations, right? That have often not benefited the communities that for so long experienced the trauma, right, of blight and disinvestment. And then finally, I'll use a personal example because I think it's centering myself in this conversation. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. My father's family was actually displaced by Interstate 81. That I know there's at least one person that I know lived in Syracuse. It cuts right through the middle of the city. Like many highways, it bifurcated a community, displaced a majority, predominantly black population. Right? And so when we think about infrastructure and that legacy of harm, right, I want you to sit with that, right? As I hold it very personally, because it's part of that origin story for my family, I think as we have this conversation, really holding how do we kind of repair that harm? How do we confront those legacies and actually do our work differently going forward?
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brenda Bateman. I'm the Director of the Department of Land Conservation and Development for the state, and I'm really pleased to be with you here this afternoon, live and in person, seeing actual humans. This is awesome. I came through a very different door. I came here by a very different route, and I bet that's true for many of you in the room, and how cool that we all ended up here together from our very different paths. I have a 30-year career in public policy and strategic planning. And early in my career, I'm actually also from the East Coast, from Pittsburgh, and I spent my early career in Washington, D.C., where I was when many of these landmark executive orders and bills that you were talking about came into play, or were put into place. And during my early career, I had the good fortune to be sent overseas. I'm an international relations major, by the way. Sent overseas by institutional investors like pension funds and foundations, university trust funds, and all of the big institutional investors who wanted somebody to put eyes on the ground and look at U.S. corporations operating overseas and to take a look at their human rights, their labor rights, their governance structures, and their environmental behavior. Just kind of get a sense of how things were going. And as you can imagine, I saw all sorts of things, the whole gamut of behavior, some very laudable, some not. But the one thing that struck me in all of the things I was noting and auditing and taking note of was the water. I'm still not sure why that struck me so strongly that it did, but I was fascinated by the use of water in communities that had very little water to go around to their households and residences and their local businesses. And I was also interested in how the water was returned to the river, oftentimes not treated. And so I was looking into those structures, and when I focused my work back in the U.S., it was the water piece that I brought with me. Probably know water quantity is really the purview of the state, and the water quality pieces are the purview of the federal government, delegated to the state. So I landed in water quantity, and I spent the last 15 years of my career with Water Resources Department. For starters, I was 15 years with the state. First Water Resources Department, writing the state's water plan, first 2 versions of the state's water plan. Then I moved to Business Oregon, where I have been lucky to connect with many of my friends and colleagues here today in this venue. I was there for a couple of years as their chief operating officer, and now I'm at Department of Land Conservation and Development, which has been a really nice really blending of all my previous experiences. You can tell right from the name, there's a conservation piece, there's a development piece. They go together, they're supposed to go together. So coming out of natural resources policy and also economic development is a nice blend for me. And I have to say, we have a lot of work to do, both to get both of those pieces on the table in parity, but then to also pay attention to the other things that we're supposed to be paying attention to along the way. I'll talk more about that in a few moments.
Thank you so much. So Brenda, that's actually a wonderful point that you were an international relations major in all of our conversations today. I didn't know I am too. See, we're all a really interdisciplinary group, like I said. So I'd like to ask both of you to just tell us a bit more about your current organizations, their missions and their work, and how it relates to our topic today about centering equity and really reconsidering equity, ecology, and economy. So Brenda, let's start with you.
Well, Department of Land Conservation and Development was established now 50 years ago, so we'll have our 50th anniversary celebration next calendar year in 2023. That's the anniversary of the signing of Senate Bill 100, which launched the state's land use planning system, as well as our department that was tasked with being the steward of that system. That is really helping to move that system forward. I will note that it's not DLCD's land use system, though. It's the state's land use planning system, and there are many, many partners, agencies, and stakeholders that, and local jurisdictions that make the system successful and that are part of the fabric of land use planning. At its core, well, let me back up and say, this is the line I always use when folks say, I'm sorry, what is it that your agency does? If you've ever flown into Oregon for the first time or returned from being elsewhere and you look around, you may have noticed that it looks and it feels a little different than most other states. Okay, all the other states. And there's a reason for that. It's because of our land use planning system. And at its core, it was meant to shepherd and shape how Oregon grows. So, of course, we all knew and expected that the state would grow in population and its economy. And as it grows, we're to look at some very specific things and conserve some very precious things along the way. So first and foremost, it was put in place to protect our working lands, our farm and forest lands, but also our open spaces, historic scenic spaces, and the features that really make Oregon special. And we do that by confining development to an urban growth boundary around our city centers and really trying to shape and shepherd where the growth takes place. And the other important piece of this is that we place an emphasis along the way on well, in statute, it's called citizen involvement. We found that to be a bit narrow, so public involvement, public engagement, that we are asking jurisdictions, as you're growing, as you're seeking more land, as you're putting your comprehensive plans in place, do your homework, but also have a conversation with your communities and demonstrate or make sure that you've got the support that you need and that this is what the community actually wants to have happen. We have been partnering with Kearns and West recently on some of our major projects. We're trying to modernize some of the pieces for which we have responsibility, and so you'll see a lot of outreach materials and a lot of outreach opportunities coming forth from this partnership. But in a nutshell, we have been working on some housing recommendations that you can now find on our website. We've been working on wildfire recommendations. We've been trying to modernize the conversation that we're having around climate change, and so our commission recently put some new rules in place last July, and we also have just completed, or maybe Thursday we'll complete a series of workshops on climate change around the state. There are a lot of really very robust conversations taking place in order to continue modernizing and updating the 19 land use goals that we have at the agency. There for now.
I'll just go.
Yeah.
So Kearns and West, I won't do like a full commercial. I'll just say like, we're really good at it. So hire us. But I'll say, similar to a lot of other firms, I mean, Kearns and West really specializes in stakeholder engagement. Right? How do you ensure that the voices of those who are closest to the problems are engaged authentically and meaningfully in solutions or decisions or visions for what is possible. We also are really specialized in process expertise, right? And we're not committed, right? We're a third-party, objective, neutral facilitator, right? Our role is not to determine what happens. Our role is to determine how it happens, right? And specializing in processes that ensure that any kind of constituent, kind of the diverse representatives across the state are able to bring their voices into rooms. And again, with that core value of trying to influence decisions that affect people's lives. And I think that's my theme that I want to leave, and I think a big part of what we're talking about today is just how we do our work matters. Right? How we go about doing our work matters. Kearns and West also for me, right, going back to that kind of the background, it allows me, right, to kind of this next arc of my career to really be in a place where the centering of values, right, around environmental justice, around racial equity, around stakeholder engagement, meaningful involvement, right, the full suite of kind of terminology that means that people can influence things that affect their lives has been really gratifying. I said I spent 7 years as the Chief Diversity and Equity Officer, which is some of the greatest work and greatest privileges of my career, and it's going to take some time to recover from that. Just very honestly, and this work has really allowed me to kind of re-ground myself in where I started my career, in that environmental justice, environmental health, and kind of stakeholder engagement processes. And then the last thing that maybe I'll leave with Kearns and West is just that I think our ability to really take people that are on very different sides of the aisle. Right? I feel like we heard one of the speakers earlier say, not everybody wanted the same thing that we thought that would be best for them, right? And part of our role is to bring folks into rooms and to try to collectively imagine together what is possible and how do we do it while hearing each other with great respect.
Great. Thanks very much to you both. So we've talked about who you are and what you're doing and where you've come from. I think you both have fascinating arcs to your careers. And Ben, as you pointed out, how we do our work matters, right? So I want to dig further into that how question. The title for this session is Reconsidering Equity, Ecology, and Economy in Land and Infrastructure Development. And so I want to talk a little bit more about how we are doing that. And Ben, let's go ahead and start with you.
I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I think it's kind of the how and the who, right? How we do the work, and ultimately who benefits. When I think about it, we were planning and having these conversations, I thought about this frame of justice and what does that look like, and I think about distributive justice and really how do we account for the distribution of benefit and harm as we do our work, right? How are those benefits allocated and distributed across our society? It's about reparative justice, right? How do we reconcile the harms of the past, right? How do we not maintain complicity in replicating practice and behavior and approaches and policies and financial instruments, fill in the blanks, that have led to such incredible disparities across populations, and particularly for low-income communities of color. And as I said earlier, it's about how we center the voices of those who are most negatively impacted in decisions that affect their lives. And I had a colleague, I know we talked about this concept of kind of democracy and good governance, and I had a colleague that used to say, our job in government is to get the best value for the taxpayer and the best outcome for the client. And we can certainly critique, right? Taxpayers are clients and vice versa, right? But in essence, what he was trying to say is our obligation is to consistently be looking to strategy and practice and behavior and approach and policy that at the end of the day results in people's lives are better off. Right? And I think we have sometimes these conversations about redevelopment or infrastructure kind of absent of that core question. Are people's lives better off, and whose lives are better off? And how do we account for those that are excluded from those benefits? And I think today, as we go through this conversation, really pushing you all to kind of center yourselves in that place. What is your contribution to people's lives being better off? What is your complicity in maintaining status quo? What is your relationship with legacy harm? Right? All of these questions that I think are so important for us to ask. As well as, one of the things that, and I'll end here, I've been really kind of holding as I heard some of the conversations earlier. As I said, I was really energized. I've seen these projects. I'm like, that is really amazing. It's beautiful, architecture, and what a wonderful reuse of space that for so long was not being used. But the questions that emerged for me were around who prioritized that use, right? How was community engaged in that visioning? Who did the work? Right? Who gets the benefit financially from this? And so I think as we go through this conversation, continuing to try to ask ourselves those type of questions and a deep level diagnosis and analysis of kind of what is our relationship to the work, what is our relationship to the community, will be really important. I'll just pass it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've not only come in through a different door on a different path, but I think I may be several steps behind. But that's okay, I like that. So this is what I have. We're talking about reconsidering ecology, equity, and economy. And I just jotted down a couple of my thoughts here. The number of features here that we've paved over, mowed over, or left to the side is, it's quite a litany. And so I was just thinking a little bit about the ecology and coming through with a water discussion and a holistic water discussion and economic development discussion. There are a number of things that I think we didn't account for, or we didn't maybe realize at the time were playing a function, and it would be interesting to go back and put a value on or start to recognize those functions. I'm thinking about the functions that the ecosystem plays in terms of serving us, right? So I'm just thinking about the number of wetlands that were playing a role in terms of serving as floodplains and serving as buffers to wind and the other disasters that continue to roll through here, the riparian buffers, the streams and the groundwater aquifers that we're recharging and providing our drinking water. I know that all of these conversations are about trade-offs, and I just wonder if along the way some of these things that didn't get monetized or didn't have a voice ended up with really the short end of the trade-off. When it comes to equity, it's the same, and we've mentioned it already, talking about paving over or paving through there. We've got entire communities that were divided or displaced or moved to the side in the name of infrastructure and transportation and other things that we needed or thought we needed, but it seems to me that probably those communities didn't get a voice in the development. But what I really wanted to talk about as part of this question was the economy. It has been increasingly apparent to me, and it took me a long time to piece it together. These are not the things that you learn in your 4th grade Oregon history class. This has come much later than the 4th grade history. But, our Constitution, the Oregon Constitution, 1859, had this exclusion clause in there. That Black pioneers and Black residents were not even welcome here. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard the history before, but I've heard it so recently that it stuns me every time I hear it or say it. And when I start to think about the ability to own land and what that means, and I can very clearly trace that thread all the way through the different points and agencies of my career. When you don't have access to land, you don't have the ability to build a home and to build equity in that home and to pass down generational wealth, which means you don't have collateral, you can't get a loan, you can't start a business. Suddenly I'm starting to thread all of this together, and it's really quite appalling. I don't know what to do with that information. I feel a little bit stuck because I've got the history and then the question, what now? So little things, and they feel so little now, but they were great points of pride for me as I moved through my career. When we were at Water Resources and we were putting together the state water plan, we held dozens and dozens of town halls and open houses asking folks what their concerns, their needs, and their vision was around water. And those were very well attended, and we had a couple of things we purposefully did to try to pull in more diversity from the community. We held sessions a couple times during the day. So one was during the business day so that the water professionals could attend, and then one at night so that community members could attend after they got off work. And we provided food because we weren't sure where folks were coming from and we wanted their very best thinking. So we provided some brain food for them. We put out some activities for kids and made sure folks knew this was family friendly so that young families could come, because these are the folks that do not show up for your public meetings, is what, age 20 to 40. And we made sure that our events were on the bus lines near public transportation, and we thought we were being very inclusive, and we were. But I think back on it, and it's clear that there were still members of the community that we did not reach with our very well-structured outreach. So, fast forward to Business Oregon, and I've learned a little bit more about translating materials into the most prevalent languages that are spoken here in Oregon. 5 languages. Do you know how many languages we speak in Oregon? It's more than 5. But how awesome that we're taking the time to translate those materials to the extent that we do, and to reach out to community-based organizations that can help be a partner and an amplifier and help us reach even more communities. And yet, I'll bet there are still communities that we're not reaching there. And then I fast forward just a little bit more to DLCD, and this is an agency that actually has public participation baked into its charter and its mission. It's goal 1 of our 19 land use goals, and it's been there from the very beginning. So there's a little bit more maturity there in terms of having a citizen involvement advisory committee and having a lot more involvement structured into what we do. And so there's just a couple of things that we've been working on recently that I'm super proud of. But again, I look at it now with a different lens and I go, I bet that's not quite enough. But what we do have is an anti-gentrification tool in our toolbox as we're doing our housing work. We've gone back and worked with a number of experts in this field to ask when communities are developing and they're meeting some of their goals, how do we make sure we don't have displacement and gentrification? And so there are a couple of techniques you can use and conversations you can have and tools you can put in place to try to guard against that as much as possible. And then 2 other things that we're doing. We're working on a rural transportation equity grant program. These are like some of my favorite words all bundled into one program. Rural transportation equity, and we're having conversations with communities that are having a hard time moving their folks around as they move between home and work, and trying to make sure that folks are taken care of and that they have the ability to get where they need to go and get home again at the end of the day. And then the third thing is I mentioned some of our outreach workshops a little bit earlier. Some of those are actually taking place in Spanish language, and so that's been great. But again, now I'm working on my list. I think there's more we can do.
Thank you so much. I just want to take a moment to reflect back on a couple things that I heard. I think it's what you're both encouraging us to do, and really the mandate for doing redevelopment and infrastructure development differently, right, is slowing down, being more intentional, being more broadening, perhaps, our cost-benefit analysis. Ben, as you pointed out, right, cui bono, who's benefiting, right, who's not, and why. So often, I think, at least in the brownfield redevelopment world, we're trying to make transactions happen, right? We're dealing with properties that have been disconnected from the forces of supply and demand, and we're trying to hook them back up so that they can get plugged back into the economy, right? And I think that perhaps sometimes can lead us to really focus on getting the deal done, right? Making the transaction happen. And what I'm hearing from both of you is that, this is important, but in the spirit of thinking more broadly, Brenda, you mentioned what has been lost, what has been paved over. I think about, now we talk about ecosystem services, we recognize that wetlands, right, provide us with important benefits, and we can put a dollar value on that, et cetera. But for a long time, that was missing from our thinking, right? That's an evolution to, to bring that in. Ben, you mentioned obligation, right? And you talked about, from government's perspective, right, what the obligation to the public is, but you also mentioned some conversations that we'd all had about the nature of democracy, right? And that democracy is not just about elections, it's about giving people a say in and engaging people around things that impact their lives. And so there's this, that really adds new dimensions to the work that we're all here doing in this room, right? That it speaks to the collective obligation that we have to structure and carry out our projects in a way that benefits everyone, that is aware of who is benefiting, who is not. Brenda, I'm really interested to look up these anti-displacement tools that you were talking about, right? That's really, really interesting and fascinating to know that, you've got tools that are online. I take it, I can go to your website, check them out?
You can.
Very, very cool, okay. So I'm going to, I do want to just push further on this topic though of reconsidering equity, ecology, and economy. I'm going to put on my devil's advocate hat. And I want to ask, is it possible to understand this as more planning, engineering, and financing, but with a twist? Like, how much more work is there to really reconsidering? This is an incredibly loaded question, so have at it. Let's go ahead and start with Brenda.
It's interesting because I hear a lot, I think we all hear a lot. My work has to do, it revolves around numbers, or it revolves around dollars, or it revolves around formulas. How much work is there really to go back and look at how we're handling or addressing issues of race and equity. And infrastructure and community planning, when you're designing places where folks are going to work and live and play and shop and learn, you're absolutely having an effect on their lives. You get to have a say in their health and their safety, their access to food, their access to recreation, to shade, and to community. And so this absolutely is, I think, about equity, ecology, and economy. I'd be curious to hear what Ben has to say, and then I might have something else to wrap up on that one.
I have a lot of things to say. I'm trying to think of what makes the most sense. One of the thing that's sitting in my brain right now is this idea that racism is not accidental. Right? Exclusion is not accidental. Right? It's built into the structures. I always butcher quotes, but it's like the quote around, the systems are operating exactly how they were designed to operate. Right? So all the things that Brenda was just mentioning, right, have been built into the fabric of how we do our work, and we've seen generation after generation what those consequences are. But I think it's also important to be able to hold, right, when I look out of this room, I was like, I don't see a lot of folks that look like me. But I think about how do we kind of walk out of this space knowing that every single one of us has an obligation, has an opportunity, has the possibility, right, to contribute to that being different. Right? Whether that's in daily practice, whether it's institutional change, whatever it is, right? We all have a role, either at the personal level or our firm or company or jurisdiction. And I'll use a couple of examples that have given me hope, right? Kind of building off of that observation. One is, when I was at Multnomah County, we had a really cool model called College to County. And, I take a discipline like the Division of Assessment, Referral, and Taxation. Right? These are property tax appraisers. Right? I know growing up, there wasn't a lot of brothers being like, I want to grow up and be a property tax appraiser. That's like, that was not, it wasn't even in the lexicon. I didn't know, still barely know what the hell those folks do. But what was amazing about this work is we worked with the division. You walk into a place and you see, mostly older white men, and you talk about their recruitment, and they'd be like, well, we recruited all these places, but, it's always the most qualified applicants. Just happen to be old white guys that have 20 years of experience and blah, blah, blah. So you're just in the same cycle of, accidentally hiring the old white guy. Right? Again, it's not accidental. What they were able to do is build a model identifying, students, low income, students of color, students that were the first ones to go to college in their family, students, international students, et cetera, and provide a pathway into this work. So they'd come in as a sophomore, they'd get paid internships, right? Paid at the same level as their colleagues, right? So it wasn't like a $10 an hour internship. It was actually like part of our HR structure. Folks would come in, be able to get the expertise on the ground, to get assigned mentors and coaches, both mentors in the discipline, but also cross-cultural mentors in other parts of the county. Knowing that sometimes you need a mentor that's like really focused on the work that's in front of you. Sometimes you need someone to just say, what the hell is this place? It might be the first time I've worked in a professional environment. I don't know how to navigate this. I don't know what the questions are that I should be asking. So it's a structure that was built. But these young folks were going through this work. After the time they graduated, they've had field experience, they've had the supervised hours, they're able to be certified, they're meeting minimum qualifications. And now you come several years later, and you walk around the Division of Assessment, Referral, and Taxation, you see these young brothers walking around being property tax appraisers. Number one. Number two, these are folks that are also now starting families and buying homes, right, and having retirement plans that some of them never could have even imagined. Some of them didn't have family that had that infrastructure. Right? So that type of investment, I tell that story because I hope it's inspiring. Right? There are possibilities and there are roles and relationships that you all can have. And then the other story I want to bring in is really around, again, kind of how do we account for our own biases. I had the opportunity to work with, I won't name the company, but it's the ambulance services in Portland, and partly analogous to some of this conversation. Where we started, that the obligations for funding requires you to do some stakeholder engagement, requires you to maybe build equity plans, requires you to do EJ as part of NEPA analysis or whatever that is, right? So we see this inspiration coming often from funding streams, and that was very similar at Multnomah County. We said, all right, if you're going to have a contract, you're going to develop and work towards equity within your organization. That's part of your contractual relationship, right? So there was an impetus for it. And so we worked with this company, and we came in. It just so happened that when we started this, we weren't going to just hand them a checklist. That's not what we were asking them to do. Here's your plan. Just check these boxes, and you'll meet your minimum qualification. What we did is said, we will work with you in a deep conversation and relationship to understand what your needs are and to work together to develop something that is feasible, that's going to move you, forward in the work, right? That partnership, that conversation, that technical assistance, that was really important. The first meeting we had, it just so happens that their own data that they collected recently prior to the conversation showed that African American Black patients, through their paramedic response, were given pain medication at a lower rate than their white counterparts. Right? It's a study they had. Right? So you talk to paramedics and they said, well, we treat the symptom. We're not worried about who the person is. I was like, well, how the hell then do you explain this? How is it that the same symptoms, the same cause and relationship to why this ambulance is occurring, you're distributing pain medications differently? Right? And there's a deep history, and that's the whole panel for itself to talk about that. But what it made them realize is that they had work to do internally. They needed to train on cultural responsiveness and anti-bias, anti-blackness. They needed to figure out how they had pipeline programs so they could hire people of and from community that could have those authentic relationships, could understand the way that maybe Black adults might describe pain, that might sound and feel and look very different. So out of that conversation, they needed better data collection to hold themselves accountable. So I use those stories because I think every single one of us, hopefully by hearing this, is starting to get those wheels in your mind spinning. What is my role? Where's my place? Where's that opportunity that I can leap into, or my firm can leap into, or that my jurisdiction can leap into, that starts to address and account for what we continue to see?
That is so wild, because your medical example has like the qualitative piece to it, the conversation you're having, the interview that you have with a patient. And I have a quantitative example also from the medical industry that I would like to share, because I think it may speak to the algorithms and the calculations and the formulas that we use in a lot of this work. My sister is a laboratory director, and she was sharing with me recently that it wasn't until 2021 that folks started tearing apart some of the algorithms they use in the laboratory and asking, how did this number come to be? And she was telling me that they were getting this calculation from the National Kidney Foundation, and there was this index or a set of numbers that they were using to try to determine kidney health. And so you take a blood sample, run it through the lab test, you get a number, and then you add a little number to it for gender, and you add a little number to it for age, and then you add a little number to it for race. And she said that the outcome of this, and this has been in place for decades, is that you get this number, and then I'm not sure what the assumption was, but Black patients then got a little bit of an extra to that number, so their numbers were higher. I don't know why. And the result was a higher number indicates better kidney health. So they were being told, your numbers have kicked you into the healthy realm, and so you don't need to be counseled on this. You don't need medical intervention. You don't need the medicine. You don't need to be placed on the list for kidney transplant and organ transplant eligibility because your numbers are healthier. And she said, we only recently started asking, what is behind this number? This is a quantitative number that's supposed to be objective in a field that's supposed to be scientific, in a field that is supposed to do no harm. Where did this number come from? And they are just now pulling that apart and questioning and thinking, oh, maybe the race number was not correct. Maybe we take that out or look at it again. So the question that started circling in my brain was, how many of us in engineering and planning and finance have calculations and algorithms and numbers that we thought were objective that turns out they weren't. I would be very curious to go back and pull all that stuff apart, the things that you thought were untouchable, look behind the curtain and see how those were formulated. At DLCD, I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion that we're moving into our 50th anniversary, and one of the things that we did at, I guess it was the 40th anniversary, was put together an oral history. So there's a whole set of videos that are up online on Portland State University partnered with us, and they're hosting all these videos. They managed to capture the stories of folks who were early planners and put the system in place now 50 years ago. And I thought it was ingenious. They managed to capture those stories and record them before a lot of those folks passed. But you look at those videos and they're not very diverse. They're not diverse at all. And so for our 50th anniversary, we've been asking ourselves, who got to tell the story, who got to be at that table. I'll bet you there are stories out there about the impacts that land use planning have had on folks that we have not heard or that we have not captured and that we have not featured. I have to say, I know my staff is very nervous about this whole line of questioning, but I think that we need to be out there searching for those stories and making sure that we document them. Again, I'm not completely certain what we'll do once we have gotten them, so I may be heading for some hot water here, but I think it's really important that we get those. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think you both talked quite a bit about questions, right? And what stands out to me is that sometimes the question is just as important as the answer. And we're all doers, right? We're all interested in getting things done, and that can lead to a bias for action, then that's great, right? By all means, let's improve communities, let's clean up contamination. But I think what you both highlighted is that there's this part of reconsidering equity, economy, and ecology is asking those extra questions or asking what the questions should be, right? How can we tweak the questions that are in front of us? And the other thing that stands out to me from listening to you both is that, and Ben, I actually think in this, I'm paraphrasing something you said earlier, so full credit to you, that reconsidering requires investing in the connection between our work and how it impacts people's lives, right? I feel like in the last 10, 15 years, we've heard a lot about empathy, right? Trying to, for instance, inculcate empathy in children and build it into educational systems. There are foundations that fund work related to, building a more empathetic society. And I feel like that's also part of what we're getting at here, right? That reconsidering requires us to, to really ask, again, who is at the table, why and why not, and to ask what other questions are not being asked, and bring those in to our calculations, right? Sometimes quite literally, as you pointed out, Brenda. So with that, we want to facilitate an opportunity for you all to ask some questions. So we're all seated at tables, right? And I'm going to ask the facilitator here. Round tables are good, right?
Round tables are great.
Okay, we like round tables. This is good. So we want to ask you, with your table mates, those with whom you're sharing this space this afternoon, to take some opportunities to share any examples that come to mind within your own industry, within your own field, where we could reconsider or reimagine some fundamental assumptions, decisions, outcomes. And if we were to do that, what could that look like? And so after some discussion, we're going to invite you all to share some thoughts, share some notes. Ben, Brenda, what else would you offer before we send folks off into conversation and go wander around?
Well, one, I would say if you're sitting by yourself, go to a table that's has other people there, so that'll be critical for the exercise. And just, I think it's just part of us trying to demonstrate, right? Like, you all are in this space where you have unique knowledge of what's possible, what you're grappling with, right? As we said, got to talk to people that are closest to the issue, and you represent that. And so part of this is also just modeling. Like, part of what we need to do is have these type of conversations in these spaces and bring to light, right, the things that you're grappling with, the things that you're imagining as possible. So we want to use that space, and Ben and I will walk around and kind of chime in and listen in and really try to create a space where some of these conversations, we're getting some of the inertia, is that the right word? Is that when things are happening? I don't know. Anyways, gets the ball rolling as we walk out of this space today. So what are we going to do? We're going to...
You're good? Okay.
So we're going to take how long? I don't know what time it is.
Let's take 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene and share some observations and then close out. So off we go. We're having some good conversations.
Well, continue them over drinks.
And we can continue them over drinks. I just want to redirect attention back up to our august speaker panel up here. I know we're the last thing standing between you and happy hour. As we wandered around, I think we heard some really interesting conversations, right? There were some really good questions being asked, and I will just say as an observer, the rapidity with which this room burst into a din of highly productive conversation really shows, I think, the degree to which these questions are already on minds. And just thank you very much for engaging in this exercise with us. So I'm going to turn to our esteemed panelists and ask, how did that go? What did you hear that inspired you? What energized you? What are some parting thoughts and resources that you would like to share? And then I'd also like, we don't have enough microphones, so actually before we get to our august panel, sorry, I'm gonna turn to the august audience members and ask if you can just project, please. Is there anybody who wants to share anything that really stood out to you, a good question or something that really energized you and that you can't wait to talk about at happy hour?
I'll run back and forth.
Okay.
I was going to run the mic.
Okay.
Of course, last table.
Okay. Many thanks to the individual not wearing heels for being willing to run it.
So my name's Allie Miller. I'm with DEQ, Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program. And something that I heard this morning that made me think, and again, it's a little outside my scope because it was focused on the Brownfield statement, but it was interesting to hear that certain corporations are hesitant to develop brownfields when there are also projects that, build affordable housing. And I think that that would be an interesting intersection for environmental justice to talk about why, instead of promoting that more to like businesses as land to reuse for industrial or development in like mechanical and engineering that way, why it was some businesses are hesitant for lands that have been designated then for like low-income housing, and how that as an EJ issue, it just didn't sit right with me. And I was wondering if like there were experts in the room on brownfields and environmental justice and like what they would say to companies that have those kinds of hesitations when there is a reality that sometimes that land does go for affordable housing. So just proposing that to the room here.
Anybody want to respond? Or EJ and expert? Oh, nice. Yeah, a little jog in.
Well, I think this is a joint response. My name is Shannon Donovan. I work at EOU, and I've been partnering with BTI in the Brownfields work and with Stantec here. And we were just talking about that earlier today, the need to do greater outreach and education around how communities maybe should be excited that they have brownfields, because it opens up potential, particularly around infill and increasing pressure on suburban growth and protecting farmlands and open space, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess the piece of the question that I think I can answer is that I think that's just an education outreach piece, and recognizing, trying to really sell it more as an opportunity rather than kind of the booby prize one gets when you have a piece of land that can't be sold, right? That it's forever gonna be thought of as the ugly redheaded stepchild. Jackie, I don't know if you want to.
And I'm Jackie Brenner. I'm with Stantec, working with Shannon and BTI. I think Shannon's really head on. It's actually wonderful been partnering with folks like her, because when I go into communities that have these education programs in them, people already know what a brownfield is, and they're actually kind of excited to work on them because there's really good PR around them in places like LaGrange and Baker. And so I think education is huge. I think being smart and understanding what your resources are and making those resources really available, and I'm excited to hear like some of the private funding opportunities that will be available Business Oregon is doing in the new year, and knowing that a business doesn't have to approach it on their own, that there's like motivated parties to wanting a brownfield to get redeveloped, and that there's assistance available even if you're a private party to do so. And that it can be a huge public benefit, and it's, tax dollars for the city, and there's, the state partners involved and everybody else. So I think that, it's a combination of education outreach and also like knowing what resources are available, making sure that companies know that they don't have to tackle something like that alone. It doesn't have to be super complicated or lack of funding that stops them from bettering a community as a whole, and that it could actually help provide a public benefit and also like be a great thing for their public relations with the community that they're about to be involved in.
Doing this on purpose?
Well, we had a good discussion at our table, and I think the thing that really impacted me and energized me is that a couple of different folks at our table said, you really have to get out and talk to people that are going to be impacted, involved, might have ideas on the project. I think the word was put your extra tufts on and get out into the field and go talk to the people. I think coming off of COVID, we got used to Zoom and we got used to not connecting, and this conference has really been fun for me because it's allowed me to connect with some people that I wouldn't have been able to in the same way. and really connecting with people to talk to them. One of the people at our table I know has gone out and walked on the row of businesses and talked to business owners and said, well, what do you think? And can you come to this? And that really personal touch, it makes a difference when you look into someone's eyes and say, I value you and what you think, and I want you to come and talk to our group about it.
You want to go ahead?
I will say part of the reason I got out, as I walk, always pass the mic. Someone who is not going to be able to hear. It's a good practice. Don't make people shout and have someone have to raise their hands and say, can you use the mic?
A lot of the folks at this table represent regulatory agencies, so DEQ, EPA, we have a tribal member, we got a tribal representative, and a consultant, and I think we all agreed that, you know, recognizing the just the nature of the inequity of the cleanup program, we cost a lot for oversight, and who can participate in our program. And so recognizing that, and then identifying resources and ways to prioritize sites based on a variety of factors, but making sure that those factors are community involved and community led, which means anyone that's worked with, you know, the program recently, we need to build that. So, so the first part of it is just recognizing it, and the second part of it is actually doing something. So that's the how, or I guess the why and the how. Thanks.
Do you want to share your thoughts, Ben? What's inspired you?
Well, I don't know about inspired, because I was realizing that I missed a real opportunity earlier. The conversation at one of the tables where I landed was about Indigenous peoples, and it started because we were talking about other countries, but you know, I was talking about our timeline here earlier, and I started with statehood. There was history before that, and I missed an opportunity to talk about how land and, well, I missed an opportunity. There are other folks out there who are still in our communities who have a voice and knowledge of land management and an expertise that I think many of us still do not have, and we need to be including that, inviting, incorporating that into how we move forward. I did want to bring a couple of resources to folks so that you have some more things to draw on. DLCD has on its website a guidebook called Putting the People in Planning. It's a guide specifically that we developed for our local government agency partners in Oregon. And it's a really nice kind of primer in terms of the different ways and the different reasons for which you engage the public, and then the different tools that you might use depending on what your goal or the conversation looks like. So that's on our website. And then the other thing I wanted to bring and just point out to you, I'm not all the way through this book yet. I'm going to go ahead and recommend it anyway, because I think it's going to, end just as great as it started. Lynn Peterson, who's the elected chair of Metro, has a book that's coming out in December, and so this is the early copy. It's called Roadways for People: Rethinking Transportation Planning and Engineering. And she's mentioned many of the examples that we've already talked about here today, and put some of her thoughts down on paper in terms of how to move forward, or how to think about some of those projects a little bit differently than we have in the past. So again, it's called Roadways for People, and it should be available shortly through Amazon.
Thanks, Brenda. Well, I thank you all. This has been, I'm invigorated by the conversations that were happening. Professor John Paul was at the Haas Institute down in Berkeley, who I consider both a mentor and a friend. He said, equity work's not rocket science. It's a lot harder than that. Right? And he says that, in some of the conversations I was hearing, we used to do a lot of work around an equity lens, and what does that mean to ask these questions and to work through these processes and grapple with the complexities. And I heard a lot of grappling with the complexities, right? Because it doesn't spit out an answer. And I think you had said this earlier, sir, right? Like the questions are often just as important, right? How we get to that next phase is really important. And so I encourage you to kind of hold that reality. The answer is not going to always be apparent. In fact, grappling with it and saying, maybe if we talk to this person or that person, we don't have the full context, we could use more information. So I was really inspired by that because I think that's actually a really important part of learning. And I think it's an important part of growth for sure. And then I think my final thoughts, I was really moved, and maybe someday people will say nice things about me like this, but Randy Tucker, right, to be described as courageous and tenacious, right, I love that so much. And I think if there was one thing that I could leave with folks in this conversation of justice and equity and reckoning and hope and possibility, is be courageous and be tenacious and get inspired by the work that Randy did for so many years to move this work forward.
Thank you so much, Jibo. Thank you to our audience for engaging so readily and so earnestly in this conversation. Ben, Brenda, thank you so much for taking the time and for all of your insights and energy that you brought with you today. Ben, thanks for going for a jog to circulate the mic. Really appreciate it. And with that, we're going to close. We're going to send you forth into the reception to go continue the conversation. And we look forward to another great day tomorrow. So just, again, thank you to you and thank you for our audience.